Thanks for joining me for today's update on the war here in Ukraine. Ukraine's counteroffensive still rages on, particularly in the east and south. And over the past week, Ukrainian forces have liberated at least 90 square kilometers of Russian-occupied land and 7 settlements in the southeast. Now, we've mainly seen villages liberated, with flags proudly raised by Ukrainian troops in recaptured buildings. And whilst the gains can so far be considered small, they aren't small to the Ukrainians living there, who have been forced to live under Russian oppression, torture, or murder for the last year. Meanwhile, despite Russian state-controlled news channels and Western Lord Haw-Haw wannabes like Kremlin-funded George Galloway constantly claiming Ukraine has made little progress and is being defeated, even the leader of terrorist mercenary group Wagner has confirmed that Russia is losing territories it stole from Ukraine.
В 3 местах у них прорвано. В Торецке сегодня идет большое накопление. Я вижу по своей разведке, у меня разведка развита. И не сегодня, завтра они начнут резать Кудюмовку, Азаряновку. Белгородская область трещит по швам. На Запорожье потеряли серьезнейший населенный пункт. Сейчас они ударят еще по северу, по югу на Донецке. Ну, кстати, с Торецкой ударят тоже вторым ударом. Первый подрежут группировку Бахмут, а вторую, Артемовск теперь, да? А вторую ударят южнее.
Now, the gains Ukraine has made so far are seemingly building up to achieving one of their main short-term objectives. Long-term, they are obviously trying to take back every single piece of land stolen by Russia, but the Russian-occupied territory that, in the short term, matters the most in Ukraine's counteroffensive is the so-called land corridor. It's an area in the south that connects to the illegally annexed Crimea. If Ukraine can split that in two, it will cut off Russian troops and make it difficult for them to resupply their garrison in Crimea. We need to also remember that the destruction of the dam in Kherson is also likely to cause huge problems for Crimea, with Crimea's clean water being predominantly supplied by the reservoir that is essentially now non-operational. And this comes after Russian troops have been withdrawing from territories on the outskirts of Kherson due to that dam collapse. So just a quick update on the situation over in Kherson following the huge floods caused by that incident. What isn't being talked about much is the impact on local farmers. Ukraine has a huge agricultural industry. Kherson in particular is famous for growing watermelons. Last year when I was down in the south, I saw local Ukrainians handing watermelons over to Ukrainian troops and volunteers. You can buy Kherson watermelons across Ukraine and they taste amazing. But sadly, videos are showing acres and acres of farming land completely underwater and millions of crops destroyed, which will put a huge strain on produce exports, but also on farmers. Before the war, Ukraine was exporting almost 36,000 tons of fruit every year. Right now, civilians are still being evacuated on inflatables and other boats, but there's now a sanitation crisis, with the flood leading to an increased risk of waterborne diseases and, of course, raw sewage contaminating the area, along with limited access to safe water, causing many other problems for that local population. There has, meanwhile, been a lot of disinformation on social media, as always, this time relating, however, to the number of people who have died in Kherson as a result of that dam collapse, with Russians saying none have died and some Ukrainian commentators claiming hundreds. But it's probably best to accept the figures given by Ukraine's own Ministry of Internal Affairs, who are saying that 5 people have died as a result of the flood so far. But that number doesn't include the 3 innocent civilians who were killed at the weekend whilst on an evacuation boat. The boat had entered a Russian-occupied eastern bank of Kherson in an attempt to rescue civilians. Russian troops not only shelled the evacuation boat, but also shot dead a 74-year-old man who was trying to rescue a woman from gunfire. Nor does it include the priest who was killed just today during shelling in the village of Belozerka in Kherson region, who was just trying to take a stroll in a churchyard. Today's attacks on Kherson have also injured a 76-year-old woman and damaged 4 residential buildings, a post office, administrative buildings, a village central square, and critical infrastructure facilities. The truth is that Russia's been actively shelling civilian areas in Kherson, knowing full well that the areas are residential and that they're likely to kill civilians. Russia and its propagandists are, of course, sticking to the false narrative that they haven't targeted any civilians during the entire war here. But that's just a complete demonstrable lie. I've seen firsthand Russia targeting civilian areas, not just here in Kyiv, but also when I've been to places like Kharkiv, where I woke up in the night to a huge explosion, looked out my balcony and saw that the local school had been hit, and an elderly woman who was seeking refuge in that school while the children were away sadly died. Obviously, there are many things I can't post on YouTube or social media footage that I've taken, and I've seen some horrific things, including dead children and other evidence of Russian war crimes. But something I can show you is the Russian torture chamber I visited in Trotskynets in the north of Ukraine. It was in a train station that was used by the Russians during the occupation of the area to torture and interrogate innocent civilians. And only when the Ukrainians had forced the Russians to flee from the area did they discover the true extent of what had taken place there. The Russian invaders had rounded up men from the area, young and old, dragged them to the train station, taken them downstairs into the bathing and toilet area, and used that area as a torture chamber, with survivors now telling stories of being tied up, severely beaten, deprived of food and water, stabbed, mocked, and stomped on. One man's account alone tells of how he was blindfolded, but could hear the man beside him slowly dying, unable to breathe, after being horrifically tortured by Russian interrogators.
Here on the ground floor is where the soldiers slept, Russian soldiers, when they occupied this region. And this was just a passenger waiting room. Upstairs was more comfortable, so that's where the officers slept. And down here is where the Russians came. They ate, they drank, and when they left, they'd even gone to the toilet on the floor. It was completely destroyed. They're clearing it up now. But beneath my feet now is where the Russians took local villagers, local men, and tortured them for information that they couldn't give. They wanted to know where the Ukrainian soldiers and their units were, but these men didn't know. So the more that they said they didn't know, the more they were tortured. Here in this chamber underneath the train station in Trotskynets, the local men were brought down by the Russian soldiers after the surrounding area had been heavily shelled, and they were tortured. I'll go through some of the accounts later on today, but they're horrific. So the men were brought down here, had their nails pulled out, were beaten horrifically. Some had limbs cut off and were tortured, and the blood is still on the walls. So this is right in Trotskynets. There were no military, there's no army here. When they were targeting civilians. When the Russians came in, they specifically targeted civilian men and wanted to get information from them, wanted to ask questions, wanted to force them into claiming that they were Nazis, etc. And here is the remnants of what was left. One man died down here. Others survived, but they were left mutilated, some with obviously psychological problems. And as you can see, I think enough words, there aren't any words for this place. All you need to do is look at the wall.
And sadly, that's just one example. During this war, Russian forces have raped, tortured and murdered thousands of civilians across the country, from Bucha all the way to Mariupol and beyond. Now, on a lighter note, both sides continue to employ the use of decoys to test air defences or drain ammunition. The Ukrainians have shot down numerous fake drones after the past month, while yesterday Russia celebrated after it destroyed what it believed to be a Leopard tank being used by the Ukrainians. In fact, it turned out to be nothing more than a primitive frame covered in some thin metal sheets and plastic. Talking of Leopard tanks, for those who don't know, these German tanks first entered service in 1979. They weigh 62 tons, have effective armour and are crewed by 4 soldiers, which is one more than Ukrainian-made tanks. However, throughout this war, we've seen the endless capture or destruction of tanks from both sides, mainly from drones dropping explosives from the sky. They're relatively slow and vulnerable, and particularly with the development of drones and sophisticated missiles, you can't help but wonder if the age of the tank is coming to an end. Today, Russian officials claimed they'd captured multiple Leopard tanks and other equipment during Ukraine's ongoing offensive, but their claims haven't yet been verified. The BBC have, however, verified that some Leopard tanks have been destroyed in Zaporizhzhia region. And it's important that we accept all facts, even those that are less favourable, so that we can form a true picture of what's happening in this war. But needless to say, the summary is that over a year later, Putin's self-declared 3-day special operation isn't going so well for him. And meanwhile, today, German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius announced that Germany was preparing to send over another 100 Leopard tanks this year. Here in Kyiv, the air raid sirens continue to sound every single night. However, over the past few months, Ukraine has obtained advanced air defense systems, including the Patriot, and Russia knows that the vast majority of the missiles and drones it sends are going to be destroyed. But in my opinion, while they're partly used to test those air defense systems and try to locate them, they're also used for psychological warfare. Millions of Ukrainians are forced to spend the day subconsciously thinking about what dangers the night will bring, go to sleep for an hour or so, and are then awoken up for hours on end, having to head off to uncomfortable shelters or, as is often the case with the majority of people here who don't have access to a shelter, sleep on the floor in their bathrooms or corridors. Now, earlier on in the war, before the West supplied advanced air defense systems, the missiles and drones were far harder to take down. Last year, I physically stood on the street outside my apartment and watched as the soldiers next to me were shooting up into the sky at Shahed drones. Then, on another occasion, I was walking to an office and had to pass the Samsung building. For whatever reason, the idea popped into my head to take a detour to the train station to buy a coffee, despite never doing that before and there being plenty of coffee kiosks on the route. But it was lucky that I did, because at the same time I'd have been outside that Samsung building, I heard what I thought was a fighter jet, looked up and saw a Russian missile, clear as crystal, flying over my head before it sent the Samsung building bursting into a ball of flames. I managed to capture the following clip that was eventually shared in a montage by President Zelensky. In it, you can hear a woman's harrowing screams and then the sound of a second missile roaring overhead and me stopping filming and running for cover. Now, as I've said, they have far better air defense systems here now, and the vast majority of drones and missiles are taken out and countless lives are saved. However, debris from intercepted drones and missiles is still a problem, leading to houses catching fire and civilians sadly becoming casualties. Also, hypersonic missiles arrive within minutes, so can frequently hit their targets. The following is exclusive audio from my brief chat with Mayor Klitschko the morning after a clinic was hit by a rocket in Kyiv, killing multiple people, including a child.
Ukraine is a target from Russians. Everyone who not agree with Russian is enemy from Russia, and that's why the Russian politics, terrorist politics. Do you see impact? Is a war? Is a special operation against the military? You see the 1,000 and 100,000 people already killed, civilians.
Today is International Children's Day. What message would you give to parents across the world? Because we've seen two children die.
If someone think the war far away from you, it's 1,000 kilometers away, it doesn't touch you, it's biggest mistake. This war touched million people in Ukraine. This war touched million people in Europe. This war can touch everyone in the world. Please don't forget. One of the biggest.
Just leaving the site of last night's attack, it's a clinic where sadly 2 children died. 3 people died in total, and 2 of them were children. Just spoken briefly to Mayor Klitschko, but we had to end our discussion because an air raid siren has gone off again. So we had to cut it short, and people are leaving the scene. But basically in a nutshell, what happened was the night before they had a problem where people who were trying to get into the shelter for whatever reason couldn't get into the shelter. Now last night there was an attack. Russia has been sending over rockets that get here very quickly now. They get here within say 5 minutes of the siren going off. It actually hit this, it was intercepted, one of the rockets, and hit the building behind me, the clinic. Multiple people died because some got into the shelter. A member of staff who was working the night shift let them in, but sadly some couldn't, and they were found dead outside. And like I said, 2 of them were children, and it's International Children's Day today. Mayor Klitschko told me that all events have been cancelled for obvious reasons, and they're opening an investigation into what happened, why people couldn't get into the shelter. but now we're going to head off because the siren, and potentially there are more missiles coming.
In other news, Russia continues to forge closer relations with Africa, and many seem to be falling for the bait, with the foreign minister for Mali confirming his support for Russia by condemning the West for being, in his words, hypocrites when highlighting human rights abuses committed by Russia, because the West participated in the slave trade. That was his reason. Well, the inconvenient truth for him, of course, is that slavery was abolished in the UK, America, and across Europe hundreds of years ago, while it's a fact that today there are over 200,000 modern-day slaves being held captive by their masters in Mali, with the Mali government turning a blind eye. So if he's looking for widespread human rights abuse, the foreign minister should perhaps look a little closer to home. Another sad byproduct of this war is the mass abduction and kidnapping of Ukrainian children who have been taken from their families and forcibly sent to Russia, where they are being brainwashed and abused. Along with many adults in occupied areas such as Mariupol, Ukraine's National Information Bureau estimates that around 16,000 children have been taken by soldiers to Russia or Russian-controlled territory since the start of the war. While some have been reunited with their parents back in Ukraine thanks to the heroic efforts of charity organisations, many sadly still remain separated from their loved ones. Speaking to me exclusively last week, Belarus's opposition leader told me that they have evidence that Putin's pal Alexander Lukashenko and his regime also participated in the abduction of these children, telling me that they had identified at least 2,000 Ukrainian kids who had been illegally brought to Belarus by Russian troops and their allies. You can read the full story on my website, Ukraine Today, by clicking on the link in the description below. And early this morning, we saw more Shaheeds and missiles launched by Russia into heavily populated civilian areas of Ukraine, with the air raid sirens sounding here in Kyiv again at around 7 a.m. I remember my nan used to tell me about how, as a little girl living in London during the Blitz, she remembered the doodle bugs sent into the capital by the Nazis, and in particular, the moped-like sound they make before going silent and dropping on people's homes, including at one time the railway near her own house. I never thought that in 2024 I'd be hearing that same noise above the streets of a European city. But unfortunately, the drones and rockets continue to come night and day here, and last night some of them hit homes and apartment blocks in President Zelensky's own hometown. So far, 10 people are confirmed to have died, around 28 are injured, and more are believed to still be trapped under rubble. Over in Kharkiv, residential buildings were hit by drones, with the region's mayor confirming that a utility company building and a warehouse had been damaged. Meanwhile, over in Russia, intelligence has indicated that Iran are helping to build a new drone-making facility near Moscow, and the UK's Ministry of Defence say that the Iranians are also likely delivering large consignments of drones to Russia via the Caspian Sea. But despite the constant attacks, despite the lack of sleep and fear of further escalation, the reality is that here in Ukraine, people have the same blitz spirit our grandparents once had. They continue to go about their daily business and live their lives to the full. Conspiracy theorists claim this means there's no war here, but of course they're wrong. It just means that the people here aren't weak-minded like conspiracy theorists. They're strong, they're full of life. And as one woman told me yesterday over a pint of local Ukrainian beer, we just want to live. Anyway, that's all I've got time for tonight, but I'll be posting regular updates on Twitter if there's another strike on the capital, which is unfortunately highly likely. So join me tomorrow night, same time, where I'll be giving you updates from the day, and we'll be showing some more footage from my travels across Ukraine, including exclusive footage from the front lines in the east, including Bakhmut. Thanks for watching. Remember to click the subscribe button so you don't miss my updates and the next episode. And most importantly, to people across Ukraine, stay safe.